Welcome to another session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books. In this session, we are going to explore the influential work of the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, the founder of modern French rationalism, who's perhaps best known for his famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes was primarily a mathematician and made many contributions to that field. Among other things, he invented analytic geometry and expanded algebra. But in spite of his mathematical genius, it was his writings and ideas in philosophy that gained him immortality. His greatest achievement is that he's considered the first philosopher to clearly show the difference between mind and matter. He developed a dualistic system of philosophical thought that divided the world into two realms, the non-material, or God, and the material, or physical. He held that reason and science could only be applied to the material world, and that problems of theology and politics, or church and state, were not to be investigated. This way, he helped introduce the age of reason and science without threatening the political and social structure of 17th century France. This delicate balance was upset later when English philosophy, led by Isaac Newton and John Locke, was imported to France and became a basis for examining French society, particularly the monarchy and the church. But until that happened, Descartes was the prominent voice in French philosophy. There are many ideas and methods associated with his work that have had a profound effect on the development of philosophy since the mid-17th century, and many of those ideas are presented in the work we're featuring in this session, his book called Meditations. Before we familiarize you with that work and with the details of his life and other works, it might be helpful to summarize some of the key points of his philosophy. First of all, Descartes believed that to arrive at the truth, man must first rid himself of all his past education and beliefs. In this way, he can eliminate all the mistakes and prejudices he's accumulated since childhood. Every idea and belief he's previously held should be considered with doubt. 2. He believed that arrival at the truth required an orderly, methodical thinking process. No hasty generalizations and conclusions could be allowed. Man must proceed carefully from simple, concrete, known objects up to the more abstract. The mind, therefore, is the instrument for discovering truth and the starting point for all philosophical thought. 3. The purpose of philosophy is to analyze the content of human thought, the subject and conclusions. Every idea should be reduced to its basic elements, one by one. 4. Descartes believed in the existence of God and felt that his own questioning and imaginings of God were proof he existed. He is seeking perfection, yet perfection doesn't exist in his mind. Therefore, the idea of perfection must have been put there by a perfect creator. And if God is perfect, he cannot deceive. So it follows that perfection, or knowledge of truth, can be attained, and it can be attained through the rational mind. 5. He believed man possesses a soul which is spiritual and is united to the material body. The soul interacts with the body in the conduct of its business. Therefore, soul and body are separate but related. 6. Will and reason are properties of the soul. The body, on the other hand, has desires and needs of its own. Morality is the ability of a man to subject his passions to the will and reason of the soul. It was these ideas and others that made a deep impact on the history of philosophy. Every philosopher who followed Descartes was in some way indebted to his original concepts, and he's considered the most influential philosopher before Immanuel Kant, who appeared on the scene 100 years later. One of the reasons for this is that Descartes broke away from traditional scholasticism. Scholasticism was the very systematic philosophy developed by medieval scholars between the 10th and 15th century, that was based on Aristotle's work and the work of early Christian writers. It relied heavily on, in fact insisted on, traditional doctrines. Descartes instead preferred the use of science and reason in attaining his truths. When Descartes broke from scholasticism, he paved the way for future philosophers to explore new and freer ways of thinking. That is why the work of René Descartes is often considered the first modern system of philosophical thought. The Meditations are the most important of Descartes' works because they contain his complete theories on metaphysics and what is called epistemology. Epistemology is the investigation of human knowledge, including its nature, limits, and criteria. In Meditations, Descartes considers the sources of knowledge, the validity of truth, the destiny of man, the existence of God, and the creation of the universe. In short, it takes on the most monumental questions of the human experience. There are 6 meditations in the book on 6 different but related subjects. In the first one, Descartes explains the reasons for his doubts about methods used to arrive at truth. The second meditation, which is really the beginning of the important part of the book, describes the human mind. The third meditation is Descartes' famous argument for the existence of God. The fourth describes errors in methods of thought and requirements for truths. The fifth talks about the essence of man's physical nature and body. And the sixth and final meditation addresses differences between the soul and the body. To understand the context of his thoughts, it's important to know something of the time in which Descartes lived, which were the years between 1596 and 1650. He was born in France, but spent much of his life in the Netherlands. 17th century Europe was an age of conflict and contradictions. It was marked by a rise in both science and in religious intolerance. Man placed his confidence in human reason and in religious authorities. In many ways, the 17th century was the first modern century. Although there was still a wealthy aristocracy ruling over a mass of miserably poor, there were also the beginnings of a middle class, made up mostly of merchants. Capitalism and material progress were becoming evident, and so man's thoughts turned from classical traditions to the practical needs of daily life. This was also a violent chapter of history, with many wars, revolts, and cruelty. But it also had an abundance of creative geniuses in every field: Shakespeare, Donne, Milton, and Cervantes in literature, Spinoza, Bacon, Locke, and Berkeley in philosophy, Velázquez, Rubens, and Rembrandt in art, and Galileo, Kepler, and Harvey in science. Alongside this genius and creativity was corruption and debauchery. Morals were lax, to say the least, and a gross sensuality seemed to pervade the entire continent. One of the strong values people did hold, at least in the upper class, was that of personal honor. Duels were so frequent in France at this time that the king tried to prohibit the practice. But this was an age of action and combat, and people were not to be deterred. Even Descartes himself carried a sword his entire life. Armed bands of mercenaries roamed Europe looking for employment, and when they couldn't find any, they resorted to robbery. There was continual war between Catholics and Protestants, and both religions allowed their princes to terrorize the civilian population. As a result, they were hated by the peasants. In spite of a rising middle class and capitalism, the Europe of Descartes was still mostly rural and agricultural. There were only 14 cities in Europe that could be called large, that is, with populations over 100,000. Most city dwellers lived in poverty, filth, and squalor, just as they had since medieval times. People living in the country fared little better. 1/3 of the residents who lived in Germany when Descartes was born were dead 48 years later, from famine, disease, massacre, and war. In his early days, Descartes was often involved in the politics of his times, politics which were based mostly on war. Louis XII was King of France, and his Minister of State was Cardinal Richelieu, the man who was the real power behind the throne. A 30-year war was waging between the Catholic rulers of Spain and Austria and the Protestant rulers of Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. Richelieu played off both sides, hoping to continue the war until both sides were so weak that France could step in and take over leadership of Europe. Descartes served in the army in the early stages of this war. France was a Catholic nation, and to Richelieu the cause of Catholicism and France were therefore one. He attacked the Protestant minority in France, resulting in the famous siege of La Rochelle, and succeeded in defeating them. Descartes took part in this offensive as an advisor. Richelieu was successful in his strategy of promoting the 30-year war. By the middle of the 17th century, Spain, Austria, and their Catholic rulers were secondary powers in Europe. France was a leader, but shared its lead with England and the Netherlands. All the organized religions in Europe, Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Anglican, were guilty of horrible tortures and atrocities in the name of their God. Hundreds of victims were burned alive for their alleged heresy. There was only one country that allowed religious freedom, and that was the Netherlands, where the state controlled the church. It was here that Descartes chose to spend his last 20 years. In the Netherlands, although his ideas were severely criticized, he was able to write in freedom. These are the times that gave birth to one of the greatest philosophers and thinkers of history. Now let's consider the life he led in these times, a life that both reflected and departed from the trends and social currents of his days. René Descartes was born in 1596 in the small village of La Haye in the province of Touraine. His father was a physician, and his mother was the daughter of a prominent lawyer. She died only 2 days after his birth, and the infant René, fragile and suffering from tuberculosis, was not expected to live much longer. He recovered, but remained a weak and frail child. Descartes' father moved to Brittany, where he remarried. He met with great success and fortune in his career, and rose to the ranks of the nobility. Descartes was always proud of his family position, but more importantly, the wealth his father left him allowed him to pursue his philosophy and studies unfettered by financial concerns. When René was 8 years old, he attended a Jesuit college that was among the best schools for mathematics. There he began his lifelong interest in that subject and his lifelong admiration of the Jesuit order. He was a good student and was exempt from the more rigorous regulations of the school because of his health. He would later rebel against the scholastic philosophy embodied by such schools, but he retained devout religious convictions throughout his life. Although the Jesuits were among the last to attack Descartes' writings, they nevertheless placed him on their index of forbidden books after his death. When he was 17, Descartes went to Paris with the intention of spending 2 years in social life, but he withdrew to a secluded house in order to devote himself to reflection and mathematical investigations. Following that, he went to the University of Poitiers and obtained a doctorate in law. But instead of starting a legal practice, he joined an army in the 30-Year War and went to Holland, where he spent the idle winter months pursuing his mathematical studies. From these and later studies in math would develop his unique and valuable contributions to that field. The invention of coordinate geometry, which made it possible to determine the position of a point in a plane by its distance from 2 fixed lines, and his analytical method, by which he first supposed a problem completely solved, and then proceeded to analyze the consequences of this hypothesis, thus working backwards, so to speak, from traditional approaches. After his military stint in Holland, Descartes joined the army of Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria, and was probably present during the crucial battle in which Maximilian's Catholic forces defeated the Protestant armies of Germany. According to Descartes, he spent the 10th of November, 1619, in a room of a farmhouse in Germany, in voluntary seclusion, formulating a new approach to philosophy. His idea was to apply the methods of mathematics to philosophical questions. His goal was to free himself from all tradition and develop an independent thought system all his own. When he left the army, Descartes toured Italy, making a pilgrimage on foot from Venice to the shrine of the Virgin of Loreto. While traveling in Europe, he devoted himself to observations of nature and human life. Descartes returned to Paris just long enough to make arrangements for a permanent move to Holland. For the remaining 20 years of his life, he lived in Holland, except the last 5 months, which were spent in Sweden. He never bothered to learn the Dutch language, fearing this would be a threat to the complete social isolation he desired. Descartes never married, but he did have a mistress who gave birth to his daughter in 1634. The child lived only 5 years. In Holland, Descartes moved 24 times, but always located himself near a university or library. All of his writings, including meditations, were completed in Holland. With the release of his book Discourse upon Method, usually referred to simply as the Discourse, he was accused of atheism and skepticism by prominent Protestants. They tried to obtain an indictment against him, but influential friends intervened, and the final judgment merely limited all discussion of his philosophy. He continued to be accused of heresy by various religious groups, but in later years was recognized as one of the leading philosophers of Europe. Descartes' fame became so great that Queen Christina of Sweden persuaded him to move to her country and become her tutor. He accepted, and she dispatched a royal ship to transport him. Unfortunately, the climate and working conditions there were difficult for Descartes. He was obliged to instruct the Queen at 5 o'clock in the morning, even in the bitter cold of winter. He came down with pneumonia and died 11 days later, on February 11, 1650, at the age of 54. His body was returned to Paris, but the funeral was interrupted by a court order forbidding the delivery of a eulogy. This was the beginning of Catholic opposition to his philosophy, which climaxed in 1663 when his books were banned. He was a threat to Catholicism because he insisted that doubt was essential in finding the truth. Yet even while theologians were railing against him, he was gaining popularity in the court and the fashionable salons of Paris, where his ideas were a source of lively conversation and debate. In time, his insistence on rational evidence and his demand for remaining doubtful in the absence of this evidence would become the foundation for modern research and science. Although Descartes made errors in his own scientific conclusions, as examples, he rejected the existence of atoms, didn't believe in the existence of a vacuum, thought the planets moved in a circular rather than elliptical pattern, and denied the theory of gravity, his methods for attaining truth contributed enormously to the future growth of science. His chief contribution was his method of doubting all prior conclusions, accepting no conclusions based on assumption, and subjecting all knowledge to the analysis of individual thought processes. These were the principles he applied to his brilliant works of philosophy. The most important of these works are Meditations, Principles of Philosophy, and Discourse upon Method. Meditations was Descartes' favorite and is considered his masterpiece. They were written in Latin and were published in Paris in 1641 with a dedication to the Dean and Faculty of Theology at the University of Paris. We're going to introduce you to that book now, beginning with the preface and then taking you step by step through the 6 different meditations and subjects. In the preface of Meditations, Descartes responds to the criticism of his previous book, the Discourse, and says he's continuing with the quest he began in that book, to meditate seriously on the important questions of God and the human soul. He advises his readers to try and detach themselves from prejudices and information they've gained through their 5 senses, so they can realize the maximum benefit of the meditations that follow. With that warning, Descartes then begins Meditation 1, which describes the reasons for his methodological doubts. He says it was critical that he wait until he was a mature man before taking on the task of the meditations that follow. He needed time to remove all his earlier beliefs, since these beliefs were based only on the perceptions of the senses. The senses are unreliable and can be deceptive. The objects they apprehend may appear differently from different points of view. It's probable, he believes, that things which seem certain when perceived through the senses are really a matter of illusion. At the same time, however, there are objects detected through the senses which must be accepted as true. For instance, at the moment he is seated by a fire, clothed in a dressing gown. It would be ridiculous to deny this knowledge of his own body. We must also admit that objects have certain characteristics, such as quantity, number, place, time, figure, and extension. There are also mathematical truths in objects. A square, for example, has 4 sides, not 5. But these ideas relate to simple and general objects, like those in arithmetic and geometry. The science concerned with more complex or composite objects becomes less reliable. Yet even with simple objects, he asks, how can I be certain that the knowledge I possess is in reality true? To begin building a valid structure of knowledge, he will start with this premise: all external reality is illusion. He will question even the idea of a perfect God. He will even assume the possibility that God is a demon who deliberately tries to deceive him. In effect, he will suspend all judgment and will allow himself to doubt everything. This is what he means by the principle of universal doubt. Descartes concludes his first meditation by saying it is very difficult to maintain this state of doubt, because the human mind will keep trying to return to familiar old beliefs that are comfortable and secure. But as long as man allows himself to follow these ruts of traditional thought, he'll never be able to dispel intellectual darkness. In the second meditation, Descartes describes the nature of the human mind. He begins by saying that allowing himself to have universal doubt is like being a swimmer who suddenly plunges himself into deep water. He can't touch bottom and he can't see the surface. But while he flounders, he must try to find the one certain fixed position from which he can proceed onward. It is like the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, who thought it would be possible to move the entire earth if he could only establish one fixed absolute point. If one is to arrive at truth from a position of universal doubt, it's essential to have a certain point of departure. At this stage, says Descartes, he assumes everything is false. There is no memory, senses, body, or any other reality. Therefore, it's possible he's being deceived by an illusion of reality. And if he's being deceived, then it follows that he exists as a deceived person. In this state of existence, he asks, "What am I?" Proceeding, he can assert that in the past he believed he was a man, and that a man was a rational animal. Now he can't accept this. He must first prove what an animal is, and what it means to be rational. This is too complicated a problem at this moment in his universal doubt. He must also hold in doubt now the attributes of his body, including face, hands, arms, senses, and a feeling that he occupies space. There is only one proposition he can make at this point, that he's a thinking thing. He knows that he exists only when he's thinking. Descartes continues in this line, saying, "I am conscious that I exist, and I, who knows I exist, ask the question, what am I?" Now that he's established that he's a thinking thing, he moves on to the problem of figuring out what a thinking thing really is. He decides that he's the same being who engages in intellectual activities like doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, refusing, imagining, and perceiving. Next, Descartes takes on a more difficult challenge, to prove the existence of his material body, which is separate from this mental state he's been describing. He states that the body seems more certain to men because they can touch and see it. But if he considers something like wax, even this approach raises doubts. We see wax, and we perceive through our senses that it has a certain size, color, form, scent, and hardness. But if we place that wax in fire, all that seemed so real to our senses now disappears. The wax becomes movable, flexible, and extended. The perception of the wax is not an act of sight, touch, or imagination. It is an intuition of the human mind. All material objects are understood by the mind alone. Descartes then remarks on how difficult it is to give up our reliance on sense knowledge, what we determine with the use of our senses. Yet we must learn to rely on our minds instead. And we must be aware that the use of language leaves room for error. For instance, the same word, wax, is used to describe the substance that was cold and hard, as well as the substance that was flexible and warm after being put in the fire. The meaning of words can create misunderstandings and errors in thought. In conclusion, when man seeks knowledge, he must look introspectively within his mind and erase all sense images. Descartes ends this meditation by making a distinction between faith and reason. He can't base any belief in reality on faith, because to him, faith is based on will. It's not an intellectual matter. Rather, it's something acted upon trust because we choose to believe it. At this point, he begins Meditation 3, which is his argument for the existence of God. Descartes starts by saying that he's a thinking being who doubts and affirms, who denies and knows. He is certain that he thinks because his knowledge is so clear and distinct. Now he knows himself, but before he can proceed further towards a knowledge of reality, he must establish the existence of God. And even though there's no evidence that God has deceived his mind into believing in a reality beyond his mind, he must consider that possibility. But to do that, he must first demonstrate that there is a God. To do this, he first analyzes the nature of thought. An idea, he says, may be an image, a form, or a judgment. The image or the form is never false. The judgment is where the errors occur. And the most common error of judgment is when one judges that a given idea conforms with the object it represents. Then he elaborates on that idea. Some ideas are innate, from within. Others come involuntarily to the mind from outside. Other ideas are manufactured by him himself, by combining innate ideas and those that come from outside. Innate ideas are guaranteed by nature. They compel him to agree to the resemblance between his idea and the object his idea represents. But in believing that his idea of an object is the reality of the object, he's motivated by blind impulse. Therefore, he can't prove rationally on this basis that objects exist outside of his mind. Descartes then suggests that ideas are modes of consciousness. An idea is subjective because it resides only in the individual mind. If we consider ideas that are images, for example, we see a variety of ideas that all vary in perfection. Since an idea is an effect, the cause of this effect must have as much reality as the effect, and any cause must have as much perfection as its effect. For instance, a stone can't exist unless it's produced by a cause at least as perfect as the stone. The idea of heat must be produced by a cause with as much perfection as heat. This principle can be applied to God. The cause, God, must have as much reality and perfection as his idea of God, which is the effect. It is the nature of perfection that a thing is perfect only if it exists. Therefore, a perfect God must exist. Descartes knows he is not the cause of his own idea of God. He believes that the idea of an infinite, perfect, all-knowing God transcends the ability of his mind. God, therefore, causes the idea of God in his mind. And because God is the cause of the idea, and the cause has as much perfection as the effect, and because an object is perfect only if it exists, Descartes asserts that God truly exists. There is another reason he says that God exists. He exists because Descartes himself exists as a thinking being who has a concept of God. If he was an independent being with every perfection, he would be God. Since he isn't perfect, he can eliminate this possibility. But what, then, is the cause of his existence? Since he's a dependent being, he must address this question to the one on whom he depends. Suppose he's dependent on some other, less perfect being. Then the question arises as to whom that being is dependent on. Eventually, he has to conclude that an all-perfect being exists as the cause of Descartes' own contingent existence. Now that Descartes has established that God caused the idea of God in his mind, he wonders how he received this idea. He concludes that it's an innate idea. At the moment of his creation, God imposed the idea of himself in Descartes, in the way a worker stamps his name on a product he's completed. He understands this idea in the same intuitive way he understands his own thinking existence. God's existence isn't something he deduces, it's something he knows immediately and intuitively. Descartes concludes this meditation by saying the contemplation of God is the source of greatest happiness in life. Even though this happiness is far less perfect than that which comes from contemplation of God in the life to come, as faith suggests, it nevertheless provides great joy. The next meditation, Meditation 4, shows the nature of error and the importance of conforming truths. He starts by asserting that the idea of God and the infinite is more clear and distinct than any idea of finite reality. The idea of God is a pathway for discovering wisdom and the truths of science, which exist in God. His belief in extramental reality can't be due to any deception on God's part, since God is a perfect being and deception is imperfect. Mental errors must instead be traced to his own imperfect nature. There are no errors in reality, therefore no errors can proceed from God. Instead, they're a defect in or lack of knowledge. He considers that God could have made him as a being incapable of being deceived, but to inquire into those areas would require an understanding of how and why God does what he does. Since God is infinite and incomprehensible, and man is finite and limited, the causes and purposes for the creation of things are beyond man's understanding. Descartes states that his mind is completely incapable of understanding God's actions. Therefore, it's pointless to ask why he's been created so that he can fall into error. However, each individual is part of the universe as a whole, and somehow the imperfections of the individual contribute to the perfection of the universe. Now Descartes talks about the source of error. He knows he possesses a faculty of cognition and also one of free choice. There is no possibility of error in the understanding or cognition itself, since the understanding merely apprehends an idea. When error occurs, it's because of free choice, or the action of the will. More specifically, it's the failure of the individual to restrain that will. The will must be restrained into choosing only the objects which are fully understood by the intellect. It is the clarity and distinctness of certain ideas that move the will to accept them as true. Descartes says this is what happened when he conceived of his own existence. The clarity of the idea within his intellect moved his will to accept it as truth. Whenever an idea lacks clarity or distinctness, the will must be restrained from judging the idea as true. The individual must assert doubt. This action of asserting doubt on an unclear idea is correct. Failure to restrain the will and abstain from judgment is what opens the door to failure. At the conclusion of this meditation, Descartes asserts that any errors he accepted in the past were the result of his own imperfections and limitations. He can't put the blame anywhere else. He always possessed the power to restrain his will, and always had the advantage of being able to obtain clear and distinct knowledge. And he possessed the resolution to suspend all judgment whenever a truth was not clearly known to him. The fifth meditation addresses the physical or corporeal nature of man. Descartes analyzes his idea of matter and presents another argument for the existence of God. He begins by saying that in this meditation he'll undertake the question of his certainty about material objects. To do this, he first examines his conscious ideas about corporeal nature to see which ones are clear and distinct. Clear and distinct ideas proceed from God and may always be accepted as truth. The first idea that is distinct to him is the characteristic of quantity which is called continuous. In addition, he can imagine the extension of a material object which includes length, breadth, and depth. He can also enumerate attributes such as size, figure, situations, and local motions. Each motion can be assigned duration, so he includes time in his imaginings. Then he asserts that all material objects contain a definite nature. They have a form and essence. This essence is unchanging and eternal. For instance, he has a clear and distinct idea of a triangle, and that triangle has a distinct form and essence. His knowledge of this essence proceeds from his reason alone. He can't sense an essence. The form comes through the intellectual process of his mind. Since the idea in the mind is both clear and distinct, it's a true idea of material reality. Material objects must therefore exist, and the qualities he conceives in them must exist. Now Descartes demonstrates the existence of God by the same method. In his mind is an idea of a perfect God. It's a clear and distinct idea. Clear ideas are true. Because this idea is true, he can proceed with an analysis of perfection. A thing can't be perfect if it's merely imagined in his mind. A perfect object must exist to be perfect. Therefore, the idea of a perfect God necessarily includes existence. Now that he's demonstrated the existence of God to his own satisfaction, Descartes uses this knowledge to affirm that material objects exist. If they didn't exist, and he had a clear idea of them, then God would be guilty of deception. But God is perfect and can't deceive. Therefore, the existence of a perfect God ensures our belief that material objects do exist, just as our clear and distinct ideas indicate. Next, Descartes takes on possible objections to this argument. Some might say there's a difference between essence and existence. Hence, his idea of an essence of a perfect God doesn't mean God exists. He replies to this by saying that in God, essence is existence. Existence is the supreme perfection and can't be separated from essence. Another argument might be that his analysis of material objects derives from a dream state. What he considers material might be pure illusion. Descartes responds to this by saying it's irrelevant whether he's dreaming or awake. he still has a clear and distinct idea in his mind. Clear and distinct ideas are true. Consequently, material nature must be true. Now Descartes begins his sixth and final meditation, in which he considers the difference between the soul and body of man. He starts by wondering if material things have a real existence independent of his ideas. He believes that mathematics describes material objects with clear and distinct ideas that support the fact of their reality outside his mind. Next, he distinguishes between imagination and intellectual conception. He can imagine a three-sided triangle, but he can't imagine a 1,000-sided object called a kiliogon. However, he can conceive of it intellectually. There is a special effort of the mind which adds to imagination. This suggests to him that imagination indicates the probability of material existence, while intellection may infer the necessity of material existence. To make a conclusion about material existence, both imagination and intellection are required. Then he recalls the conclusions he reached in the past on the basis of sense information alone. Now he wants to examine the reasons for doubting the existence of those things. In the past, he believed he had no knowledge unless it reached him through the senses. As a result, his ideas lacked clarity. Such a belief leads inevitably to skepticism and complete doubt of everything. However, he doesn't wonder that he once trusted his sensory perceptions, since they appear involuntarily, like pain, pleasure, sadness, and joy, and suggest an outside force. But as he grew older and more experienced, he realized that the same object appeared differently upon different occasions when sensed. A tower might seem round one time and square the next, if the vantage point was different. So sense information leads to errors in human judgment. If he depended only on these senses, he couldn't determine if he's awake or sleeping. The same senses present a reality to the sleeping mind that is pure illusion, but that seem like an extra mental reality to the awakened mind. So how can anyone be certain of the existence of material reality? He can't be sure that objects exist in reality in the way that the senses report them. What he knows clearly at this moment is that he was produced by God as a thinking being. With this certain knowledge of his own thinking existence, he begins to know himself better and to recognize his Creator. Next, he states that since he has a passive faculty that allows him to receive sense impression, there must be an active faculty that exists independent of his own mind. It produces the images received by his mind. This active faculty has to be God or some other object existing independently of his mind. Then he concludes it can't be God, because sense knowledge is often erroneous, and God, being perfect, is not a source of error. Therefore, these ideas must arise from a material object which exists in reality. There exists, therefore, a material reality composed of material. In addition, God is the cause of nature, and nature teaches that material reality exists. It teaches him he possesses a material body through feelings of hunger, thirst, and pain. Evidently, the mind is not the source of hunger, so we ought to accept the evidence of material existence as nature dictates it to us. Descartes then explains that he's lodged in his body as a pilot lives on a ship. As a result, his mind and body form a unity. Nature teaches that other material objects exist too, such as food. But nature is never a source of error. It is man's judgment that errs. Nature may lead us to desire poisoned food because we're hungry, but it's our judgment which decides whether to eat the food. Neither nature nor our bodies deceive us. There are enormous differences between the mind and the body. The mind is not divisible, whereas the body can lose certain parts and still function. When it does, however, the mind can never be diminished. It may receive sense impressions from the brain and, as a result, act in unity with the body. But it doesn't receive impressions directly from the separate parts of the body. Descartes says that because he's a thinking being, he's spiritual in nature, and is therefore distinct from the material nature of his body. His mind inhabits his body and must interact with it. Errors might result because of the weakness of the union. so the mind is on guard. It's imperative to restrain our will and move only towards those ideas which are clear and distinct, if we are to avoid error. With this final bit of advice, repeated often in the book, we reach the conclusion of René Descartes' Meditations, a work that helped establish an entirely new approach to knowledgeable thought and investigation, which influenced not just philosophy, but science and mathematics. Perhaps his greatest contribution to these new methods was the idea he put forth at the very beginning of his Meditations, the idea of doubt, or as he puts it, universal doubt. It was this encouragement to doubt all we've previously learned and believed, particularly if it was based on the perception of our senses alone, that freed men to give up their prejudices and conventional ideas, to pursue a more real and workable truth. Descartes put his confidence instead in intuitive knowledge, those ideas that come to us with clarity and distinctness, and which do not proceed from our sensation of an external reality. Such clear ideas stimulate the will to accept them as true. Existence is something that's intuited. It's apprehended immediately by an active intellect and is therefore true. This includes his own existence as well as the existence of God. However, Descartes admits he can never know God in the same way he knows himself, since God is infinite and therefore can't be understood by a finite mind. Since he is limited, he could never even possess the idea of one who is unlimited, eternal, and perfect. Yet he does. Therefore, the idea was given to him by the one who is perfect. The idea of a perfect being logically implies the existence of such a being. If the idea is perfect, it must include existence, for any perfect being would be imperfect without existence. Therefore, God must exist. This is the ultimate conclusion that results from the structure of knowledge Descartes has created in his Meditations. First, he doubts the truth of all he's learned before. Second, he finds one certain principle on which to rationally build all his following conclusions. For him, that principle is, I think, therefore I am. This he knew by direct intuition. It was a clear and distinct idea, and his will acted upon it to make it true. From that one fixed absolute point, he was able to establish for himself a series of related, cumulative truths that spiraled upward and upward until he had his personal evidence for the existence of God. For some people, this evidence was convincing. For others, it was faulty, even sacrilegious. But the meticulous method and logic he created was to have a profound impact on many disciplines, and was the foundation of modern philosophy.
This is the end of the session.